Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're opening up a kind of historical case file. We're going to be looking at one of the most influential writers in all of history, a man we know as Luke. And we're not just reading his work, we're putting it under the microscope, treating it like a series of historical reports that need to be verified.
Now, right away, that brings up a huge question. How on earth do you fact-check a story that's 2,000 years old? It's a massive challenge, right? You can't just pick up the phone and call a source. You need hard, physical evidence, stuff that's actually survived all that time.
And the answer is, well, you start by digging. Literally. For hundreds of years, skeptics and scholars have been putting Luke's accounts to the test, and what archaeologists have managed to pull out of the ground is, to be honest, pretty stunning. The physical record has given us this incredible string of confirmations for what he wrote.
Okay, let's dive right in. Our investigation is going to start with Exhibit A, the physical proof. I'm talking about actual objects you can see and touch, things pulled right out of the earth that speak directly to the claims Luke was making. So, first up in our case file is a name you probably recognize, Pontius Pilate. Luke mentions him in his gospel, gives him a very specific title, and places him as the governor of Judea at a very specific moment in time.
In Luke chapter 3, he calls him the governor, or prefect of Judea. Now, for the longest time, there was no physical proof of this guy outside the Bible. But then, in 1961, archaeologists working in the city of Caesarea found this stone. The verdict? The inscription clearly names Pontius Pilate and confirms his title was Prefect of Judea. A perfect match, a direct hit.
Okay, so let's move on to the next case file, because this is where a pattern starts to form. This time we're looking at a man named Gallio. He's mentioned in the book of Acts as another Roman official, but in a totally different part of the empire.
So in Acts, Luke tells this story about the Apostle Paul being brought before Gallio, who he calls the proconsul of Achaia. So was that right? Well, over in Delphi, Greece, archaeologists found a bunch of stone fragments, and when they pieced them all together, this Delphi inscription turned out to be a letter from the Emperor Claudius. And who does it name? Gallio. And it confirms he was in fact the proconsul there, and it even helps us date his time in office to around 51-52 AD. Another incredibly precise detail, confirmed in stone.
And the details, believe it or not, get even more specific. It's one thing to get a major governor right, but what about some local city official? Let's open the case file on a man named Erastus of Corinth. This one is just brilliant because it shows the kind of depth we're talking about. The writings mention a man named Erastus, the city's director of public works in the city of Corinth. And guess what? In the ruins of Corinth, archaeologists dug up a pavement inscription from that exact time period. It reads, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid this at his own expense. It confirms a man with that name held a high-ranking public office in that city. How specific is that?
So, we've got people and their very specific titles totally locked down. But the evidence goes way beyond just that. Let's move on to Exhibit B and zoom out a bit, because this builds from just individual officials to a really stunningly accurate map of the entire Mediterranean world.
What scholars find so compelling is what they call eyewitness-level knowledge. See, Luke doesn't just name-drop places. He gets their specific, sometimes really obscure, political statuses right. He knows about the local army units. He describes sea routes, the prevailing winds, even travel times with a kind of familiarity that just screams that he'd actually been there. His description of huge sites, like the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, lines up perfectly with what we've discovered from archaeology.
Now, let's just step back for a second and look at the sheer volume of all these details. This isn't about a few lucky guesses here and there. What we're seeing is a pattern of just relentless accuracy. This is where it gets really wild.
Let's just do it by the numbers. Across his 2 books, Luke names 32, that's 32, distinct countries and regions. And think about that for a second. Every single one of them has been verified as being correct within its proper first-century political and geographical boundaries.
But he doesn't stop there. He also names 54 different cities. And we're not just talking about the big famous ones like Rome or Jerusalem. We're talking about smaller towns, regional hubs, and tiny ports scattered all across the Roman Empire. And for a story that has a whole lot of sea travel, he correctly identifies 9 different islands, all the way from the big island of Cyprus down to the tiny speck of Malta. So, this is the crucial point. You add all of that up, 95 different countries, cities, and islands. Across that massive list, how many confirmed, verified, absolutely proven errors have modern historians and archaeologists found? The answer is 0. Not a single one.
Now, a track record like that doesn't go unnoticed. And it's not just us looking at the raw data. The experts, the people who have spent their entire lives studying this, have reached a really strong consensus. So let's bring in our expert witnesses.
You got to hear about this guy, Sir William Ramsay. He was a world-class archaeologist who started his career as a total skeptic. He literally went out to what is now modern-day Turkey, fully expecting to prove that Luke's account of Paul's journeys was just a work of fiction. But after years and years of fieldwork, of digging and retracing the steps himself, the evidence he found on the ground so completely overwhelmed him that he did a full 180, concluding that Luke was, and I'm quoting him here, a historian of the first rank.
And what's so fascinating is that the case for Luke's accuracy has only gotten stronger over time. You see, critics used to point to things they thought were obvious errors. For instance, Luke used this really obscure title, Politarchs, for the rulers of Thessalonica, a word found nowhere else in all of classical literature. So everyone just assumed he made a mistake. And then we started finding inscriptions, dozens of them, and they confirmed that Politarch was the exact correct local title used in that city at that time. Again and again, things that were once labeled as errors have been completely overturned by what archaeologists have found in the dirt.
So, after looking at the physical evidence, the geographic footprint, and listening to the expert testimony, what's the final verdict? What's the takeaway in the case for Luke the historian?
Well, get this. The historian Colin Hemmer did this incredibly painstaking study of just the second half of the book of Acts, and he identified a staggering 84 specific details. We're talking names, places, titles, little details about travel that have been directly confirmed by historical and archaeological research. 84 separate points of contact between the words on the page and the facts on the ground.
And all of this leaves us with one last big, thought-provoking question. The evidence seems to overwhelmingly show that Luke was a meticulous, careful, and just astonishingly accurate historian when it came to all the small, verifiable details. So, when an author gets that many of the small things right, what does that suggest about their credibility when they start talking about the bigger story they set out to tell? That's something worth thinking about.